Well, I guess to jump right in, I'm gonna have to get over the weirdness of talking about myself. How it is.
What if you talk about yourself in
But
the third person? Would that make it easier?
uh, probably not. But anyway, so yeah, I like the name of your podcast, The Outsider's Perspective. And that's kind of I share that view. I kind of feel like I've always been an outsider. Just because of the strange circumstances that I grew up in. First of all, I grew up the son of a missionary / pastor family. Southern Baptist. My dad was a pastor at several churches, and then became a missionary in South America, and we moved to South America for a while.
So, whereabouts in South
So
America did you end up moving to?
we moved to Bogota, Colombia, when
Okay.
I was a freshman in high school.
Oh, wow.
So that was a really interesting transition. And then also, the other thing that kind of makes me a little bit of a weird person is that I was homeschooled for most of my life. So those two things just kind of, really made me a lot different than most of the kids I grew up with. And, it was really, I've always had a spiritual bent because of, my family. My mom always, anytime I asked any questions about anything, and I was a very inquisitive child, she would always, give me some explanation, but then point out to me that God did it. Like, why is the grass green, Mom? Because there's chloroform in there, and because God made it.
Well, at least you got both sides of it, right? I mean, you got the science and you got the theology all in one go.
Yeah, exactly. So I always grew up with this perspective of God, did things, and because I was always in church, always in every Sunday school class I was there, every, even, music practices I was there, anything church related I was always there. My whole life revolved around church. My whole life revolved around Christianity and the Bible and all this kinds of things. So I grew up just very spiritually oriented in every aspect of my life. So just, spirituality was a very natural thing. What wasn't natural was the church itself. Because, after a few years of growing up in the church, I was a very inquisitive kid, and I always wanted to know, like, why did Jesus do this? Why does the Bible say not to do this? Why, I was always asking, my Sunday school teachers questions about things and probably annoying the crap out of them.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you went a little too deeply, right? I mean, I feel like that usually is when they start to get irritated. They'll entertain the first couple questions, but if you keep pressing, they're in my experience at least, they get a little bit frustrated.
Yeah, exactly. It always just kind of ends with, well, just God did it. Shut up and listen to the Sunday school lesson.
Right.
So, I don't know how to describe it other than, after, I had a really good childhood where, I was kind of brought up in, this very spiritual, God-loving type of environment. But slowly there just creeped in something, some kind of discord in the background that I just couldn't escape from. And it was mostly watching people and their hypocrisy and how, we say certain things, we believe certain things, we believe in love and faith and service and all these other things, but people are selfish and mean and cruel. And in the church, and even my own parents,
Right.
who were supposed to be, these, examples of, goodness and, all these other things that we supposedly talk about all the time. And that discord really ate at me. And it's, that plus, I was a loner as a kid, so I was very isolated, especially because we were homeschooled. So I've had very little social interaction with anyone basically up until high school. And so, I was completely self-taught in just about everything. My parents didn't teach me very much other than, just answering my pesky questions.
So what was, sorry, what kind of homeschooling, like you said you were homeschooled, but it sounds like you basically homeschooled yourself is what you're saying.
Yeah, basically. I mean, they bought us books, like homeschooling books and stuff, but they didn't really teach us anything out of the books. So it was my job to basically, and I was the oldest of three boys, so I basically taught myself and then taught my brothers.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. So, pretty much, and so so by the time that we moved to South America, I had all these years of school that I basically just taught myself, and it was a miracle that I really was able to adjust at all to a high school, which is where they ended up putting me once we got there.
Mm-hmm.
So, all that to say, it's just, it was a weird, I kind of had a very spiritual upbringing, and then as I got older, I kind of just felt myself getting dissatisfied with it because it wasn't what it was, taught, basically. People didn't act in the ways that we were taught they should act, and so if this doesn't help anyone, then why do we do it? What's the point?
Right.
And so that got even further, when I ended up going to college at a Christian college. And, I took a lot of, actually, like, theology classes where they teach you, like, how to, study the Bible in Greek and Hebrew and, how to basically, analyze the Bible down to the nth degree. Which was a very interesting, very, very interesting stuff. But I kind of went to a philosophy class one day, and it just kind of like rocked my world. Like this one thought that got into my head just kind of changed me forever. And I think it was Aristotle. And the whole prime mover argument where, there has to be,
the first cause.
First cause, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, this thought kind of popped in my mind. Well, if God is the prime mover, essentially, he would have to need a reason to move in the first place. Like, he wouldn't just move for no reason. And if God was perfect, then that would imply that God doesn't need to move. He would have no needs, because movement implies that you need to do something.
Right.
At least it did to my, college philosophy age mind.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, either God isn't perfect or God doesn't exist. And so that one philosophy class with that one thought that popped in my head had basically just exploded all of my belief system.
But at that point, you'd already had some doubts, and it sounds like there was already some cognitive dissonance going on, right? So this wasn't like the first thing that triggered it, was it?
No. It wasn't the first thing, but it was kind of like the last straw.
Right.
And I just after I was already like I said, I was feeling that cognitive dissonance with not seeing change in people and feeling people's hypocrisy, and then also you go through your teenage and college angsty years where there are and especially with me having been I went my whole life being homeschooled, and then I go to a Christian high school, and now I'm in a Christian college. But even in a Christian college, I'm getting progressively less and less insulated to the world. And there are atheists, and there are, agnostics, and there are, people talking to you, trying to get you to believe different things. And, my faith is already kind of on the edge.
Right.
And so this one thing just kind of went kablooey. It just tore, the structure that was already kind of on its last leg.
So how long ago was that, Tyler?
That was 2005, 2004, 2005, somewhere
right.
in that area. So at least, 10, 11 years,
Yep.
something. But so that kind of, it knocked my socks off, and pretty much ever since that point, I just kind of spiraled into a deep, dark pit of despair. Because, because that had basically been my entire life, was God, believing in God, believing that He loved me, believing that He created the world, all this kinds of stuff that comes along with, traditional Christianity. And if that didn't exist, then, where was I? I was, completely, just kind of floating in the ocean with with nothing to hang on to. So I go from that, and it was a slow spiral, but it was definitely a spiral into just a very, dark place. And it just kept getting progressively darker. And, I started getting into nihilism. I started getting into, existentialism. I started getting all these things, and none of it really seemed to help, because, the thing about, once I threw away the life preserver, then I didn't have any, because when you grow up with a certain, belief system or methodology, you generally have like a prism through which to view things, a prism through which things make sense.
Yeah. But
when you don't have that, then you don't have any yardstick to judge anything by. Does that make sense?
100%, totally.
So, nihilism sounds interesting, but is it true? I don't know. I studied, ancient philosophy, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, all these different, various things, and I was just looking for something to hold on to, basically, and all of these things proved very interesting, but how can I really, they're all just opinions at the end of the day. How do you tell which one's true above the other?
And then you've got Marcus Aurelius, who's a Stoic, telling you exactly what you just said, right? All his opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it was just a very, frustrating thing to just kind of be like, okay, well, eventually, after several years of searching through as many philosophies as I could go through, I just kind of threw my hands up and said, I give up. I guess there is no truth. I'll just stick with nihilism, since that seems to say that there's no truth, and we'll just go from there, because it's all, I can't really stick my neck out for any kind of opinion that is unverifiable, right?
Right.
Well, then, I had an experience that I don't know how to describe it, but it was like I was sitting on the bed, and I wasn't thinking about anything in general, and I was just kind of in a weird, places where your mind is just kind of free of any thought or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, it just feels like I'm being sucked through this vortex of this, rainbow of color and sound, and it's it's almost like the walls merged with the sounds I was hearing, and the sounds merged with the colors, and it all just kind of swirled into this one rainbow. I don't know if that is sounding completely weird, but that's what it kind of felt like.
It sounds psychedelic. It doesn't sound weird at all. I've had those experiences myself, sir, after eating mushrooms.
Yeah. And I remember looking after the initial shock wore off of what is happening. I just kind of looked around, and I just had this realization that, I've been deceiving myself, that things aren't what they seem. And after that happened, I couldn't really go back to my old ways of nothing is true, because I knew something had to be true after experiencing that. And so ever since then, I've just kind of been on a quest to find out exactly what that is and how I can describe it and how I can, both, connect myself with it and connect others as well. So, really my main, focus has been just, truth in general, just I'm a truth nut, I guess, if you want to describe it that way. I really just want to, find something solid that, and, the more and more I looked, the more and more I turned inward and discovered that, it may sound weird or corny or I don't know, but just the truth is, inside us. It's not out there.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, you're looking for stability or something, concrete. The only thing that you're ever going to find that's concrete is your experience. That's the only thing that you can really be certain of, right? And that's taking place inside of you. So to go within is, I think, what a lot of us in the Thousand Paths and everywhere, not just there, but in a lot of other circles, I feel like that's what's starting to happen is this shift where people are starting to realize like there is no savior out there that's going to help you. You don't need to look up in the sky. You need to look in the mirror, right? You're your own savior. Mm-hmm. Everything that you need is really inside of yourself. So, so that's where you started to turn then.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a little bit of an interesting, path to get there because I kind of went, in an unusual way. I kind of started, I kind of dropped spirituality for a while, after I just kind of gave up. And I started turning, of all things, to like political and economic theory. And I don't know why, but something in me just really wanted to know more about political and economic theory. Like there was just something within me that was driving me towards that. And I think it was, after the recession happened in 2007, 2008, I lost my job as a result, direct result of that, because I was working in the automotive field, which kind of tanked after the recession happened. And there was just some part of me that wanted to know what caused that and why it was happening. So there's a lot of this stuff that I don't agree with necessarily anymore. Like, I studied a lot of Ayn Rand, objectivism.
Right.
I was really into that for a while. And I don't really agree with it as much anymore, but one of the really interesting things that it teaches is to, extreme self, individualism and self-study. And it was actually through that I started to study myself and figure out what's going on here. And once I started doing that, I realized that, I'm not the person that I think I am at all. And that really led me to some other interesting conclusions, which led me toward personality studies. And the Enneagram is, I think, probably the biggest one that helped me really just know myself in a way that I had never been able to before, because it gave me a map of myself that was more accurate than any other map that I'd ever seen. And kind of by studying that map, it made it a lot easier to determine what was true based on getting my own biases out of the way.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, I was just going to say, without using something like the Enneagram or one of those types of personality tests, the task of, you and I are big on know thyself, and how exactly can you really come to know your biases, your sort of your prejudices, and all those things that you've never really bothered to look into. Do you think there are other ways for people to do this other than personality tests? Because it's something that I've done sort of personally, naturally over the years, and I can't, when you just are inherently doing something, it's hard to explain how you do it, or even to understand your own methods in a way. So I'm trying to find a way to almost like create a formal method, or if you know of one, like other than these personality tests, it seems like it's hard to explore yourself in that way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the one of the other things that I've been really interested in the last few 6 months to a year is fourth way, which is the Gurdjieff system for spirituality, and which is basically just self-observation. Like, that's all he tells you to do, is basically put yourself in situations where you're uncomfortable, or there's some kind of friction, or some type of cognitive distance within you, and just observe it. Anytime that there's any kind of pain or suffering, or some type of irritation or whatever, it's always some kind of reaction within yourself that's happening. And so if you can observe that as it's happening, then you're basically knowing yourself right there.
Yeah.
And it's basically a method designed to bring out those dissonances and irritations and automatic reactions, and basically just observing them one by one. And because I find that it's almost like where a person is almost like a puppet with like 1,000 different strings attached to them. And the only real way to get rid of your strings is to cut them one by one. Like, mm-hmm. You can't just cut them all off.
Because some of them might be important, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, some of them are from your childhood. Some of them are from your culture. Some of them are your society. Some of them are just habits you picked up, or reactions of things. It's all, your ego is all just this. It's a spider's web of context that you've built up over the years.
Yeah.
And you can't just, brush it away with a broom. You have to use, sometimes you have to get some scissors and cut each string. And that's, the fourth way is basically trying to bring all the strings up to the surface so that you're observing them consciously, and, kind of cutting them one by one. Which I think is a really interesting way to approach it. Some of the methods are a little extreme. They try to really push you to the limit to, get you to go beyond what you think you can do. Mm-hmm. So that's for some people. It's not for other people. I agree with some of the methods. Some of the methods I think are a little too much, but overall, I think it's a good methodology for knowing yourself.
Yeah, the thing that you just said about getting people to push themselves further than they normally would go. It's funny that you mentioned that. I went for a run the other day, and I was thinking about this, because you get to a certain point, especially because I hadn't run in a while. I got 20 minutes in, and I wanted to give up. My body was like, "You can't do this." And I thought to myself, what if I just ignore that voice and I just keep going and see how far I can go? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So a lot of the times it's like there is a limit. Your body will tell you when that limit, when you get to that limit, but it won't tell you with words. You won't be able to run anymore. You'll stop. So anytime that you start to engage in that sort of inner dialogue of, oh man, my legs are really sore and I'm breathing really hard, I should just stop for a few minutes. That part of the thinking is not genuine. It's not real. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you can often push yourself a lot further physically in tasks if you just basically either ignore that voice or shut it down if you can, right? Focus on your breathing or whatever. So.
Yeah. I find that and it works that way really in not just your body, but your mind and emotions and all these other kind of things. It's just perceptual. What you think you can and can't do often determines what you do more than what you actually can do.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, everybody has physical limitations, but I think we rarely actually reach those. I think we often stop shy because we have mental limitations, right? That stop us from going all the way almost.
Yeah, for sure. I know with the fourth way, it's basically just, every man, audits himself, and no one else is responsible for him other than himself. So everything that's learned has to be self-verified. So someone can give you some information or some knowledge about something, call it transcending ego or experiences of unity or anything, any other mystical term you want to call it. But if you haven't experienced that yourself directly, then you can't take anyone else's word for it. Everything has to be self-verified, and you can only self-verify to the level that you're that basically, he developed this term that we still use today, which is to work on yourself. So to the level that you're able to work on yourself, and to the level that your kind of consciousness and awareness grows as you're working on yourself, is to the level that you'll be able to basically verify anything else.
So the more you work on yourself, the more accurate your self-observation becomes, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah. That makes sense. Because as you're weeding out biases and all those types of things, you gain more clarity, and so you actually can see things as they are rather than how you perceive them through the prism, as you called it, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I like the prism analogy because in a sense, you could say that your biases and your preconceived notions are sort of like a prism as well. So if you're looking through the prism in search of the prism that you're looking through, it's kind of hard to find it.
Yeah. So the idea is to know that you're looking through a prism, but to gradually gain clarity until the prism disappears.
Right. That's a nice way to put it. So you're kind of like, once you become aware of what your biases are, you can observe them in action, so to speak, in your life. Like you said, like you're looking through the prism, but because you know you're looking through the prism, you make adjustments, if you will. You could say like, this looks this way, but it's not actually this way. It looks this way because of my preconceived notion about this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And every situation and every difficulty is a puzzle. But the thing about puzzles is you can't solve a puzzle unless you know it's a puzzle. So basically it's putting the power of knowledge in your hands, saying this difficulty that you're encountering, it's a puzzle. Know it's a puzzle. Know that you can solve it through awareness of yourself. And once you've solved it, you'll gain more clarity to solve the next puzzle. And you'll just keep going until you've solved all the puzzles. And then the fourth way disappears. There's no more fourth way anymore. It's just clarity.
And do you think that there's that's actually an achievable goal, that some people actually get to the end of the fourth way and they're just they don't need it anymore and they don't have to continually sort of train themselves the way they've been doing over the last few years?
I think so, but and I'm not saying that I'm at the end of the fourth way, but, and I'm not using the fourth way exclusively. It's one of I'm one of those people. I like to combine as many ways as possible to kind of get the best approach for the situation. So, but I do see the benefit of it, and I do see myself at least. I think seeing things more clearly than I did before. Of course, I could be deceiving myself, so I won't leave it to anyone else to judge that, other than my own my own direct experience of what's happening is the only thing I can really depend on.
Yeah.
But in my own experience, it does. I do seem to be gaining clarity and having less suffering in my life by observing the suffering and solving the the puzzles of the suffering that I'm going through, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm not saying that there's no progress. I think that, again, you've certainly found progress in your own practice, and I've also found some progress in mine and the way I react to things and the way that my mental health is. But to get to a point where, I think the reason that personally I've made progress is because I'm like yourself. My face is always in it. My head's always in it. Every day I'm reading about it. I'm writing about it. I'm thinking about it. It's the first thing I think about when I wake up. It's a way of life for us, right?
Sure.
And so when you said sort of when you get to the end of the fourth way, it falls away, and then there's nothing left. You're just free. I'd love to believe that, and I hope that that's the case. That eventually you get to a point where you've made enough progress that you don't need to constantly train yourself and constantly observe yourself and be sort of like, what's the expression in the Bible? The servant who's waiting for his master. You're always alert.
Right.
I'd love to get to a point where it's not like that, where it really is what you're describing, where it just falls away and you are clear. But it seems like for me, I've made a lot of progress, but I'm always finding myself backsliding, and I'm always finding myself relapsing or having, temper tantrums or whatever it is. So I'm just curious. I'd love to meet somebody who's gotten to the end of the fourth way or the end of their path, and who's just, like you read about these sages and stuff, right? They're all zenned out, nothing can flap them, and it's just like,
yeah.
I'd like to see somebody like that just to know what it looks like.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that's the reason that, I think there is an end to the road, because even though I haven't met one of those people personally, and like you said, I would love to, just to verify it for myself. It does seem, if you look at, history, Jesus, Buddha, who named Zen masters, take your pick of whoever, whatever example you want. It seems like there are people that do exist that have gotten to the end of whatever this path is, that it seems to just be a natural, state of affairs for them. So whether or not that they're just full of BS, or it is something real, who knows? All I can know is the progress that I'm making, and hopefully we'll continue to make. So yeah, that's really all I can say at this point.
Yeah, well, I'm in the same boat, and if there is no end of the road, I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't need a sort of final destination to do this. I think any kind of progress and any kind of improvement is worth struggling for, even if you can't get past a certain point. Maintaining that certain level of awareness and equanimity, I think, is worthwhile. So I'm in it for the long haul, whether there is an end to the road or not. I'm just curious to see what other people think, because some people, I think, do think that you can get to the point where you're awakened or enlightened or whatever you want to call it. And in fact, we met on the subreddit Are Awakened, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, it seems like there's a lot of people on that subreddit, for example, or at least there were at one time, that not only claimed that you could get there, but claimed to be there already. And
Sure.
and reading their comments and interacting with them, it's hard not to be skeptical. But is that my ego? Because I'm like, I want to be like that, or who knows, right?
Yeah. I think there's a difference between, being awake and being enlightened, if you want to put it that way, or being at the end of the road, or whatever kind of term you want to use for it.
Yeah.
And the difference is, I think, and I think that a lot of people kind of get to this point, but they're not sure what the next step is. But being kind of awake just kind of means that you kind of see your ego in action. You kind of see that you're a puppet on a string, and you want to do something about it, but you're still a puppet on the string. The only thing that you've gained is just knowledge that you're a puppet on the string.
Which is the first step to cutting those strings, right?
Exactly. So reaching the end of the road is cutting all of your strings off. So I'm at the point where I see that I've got a lot of strings, and I'm just working on trying to cut them one by one. Whether it ends up getting me somewhere or not is really besides the point, because it's helping me here and now with my own reactions, and my own suffering level is reduced significantly. So if that's all the progress I ever make, I'm perfectly happy with it.
Yeah, that's sort of how I feel about it. It's any improvement is better than no improvement. Nobody wants to backslide or to stagnate, right? Everybody wants to move forward in some regard. So
Yeah.
The funny thing with those strings, I feel like, to use your analogy, every time I cut a string, I feel like it's a hydra, and another couple strings pull. I discover a couple new ones to take its place, and I'm like, oh, I didn't even know about these ones.
I kind of, to use another analogy for it, I kind of feel like, you know, it's almost like you're a planet, and you've got this like gravitational like field around you that attracts certain things, and your ego is kind of like a moon or a big asteroid that kind of revolves around you, and each one of your egoic tendencies is a new asteroid or moon, and they kind of circle around you like like you circle the sun, but it's only when they block your view of the sun that you actually notice them. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
when they're just flying around and they're not blocking the sunlight, you don't pay any attention to them because they're outside of your conscious awareness.
Right.
But when they kind of obstruct you, they obstruct your the sunlight you're getting. You're like, oh, there's that moon, and
right.
I should really get rid of that because it's kind of blocking my tan.
That's a good analogy too, man. I like that. Yeah, it's funny that way. So you bring up the ego. I got to ask you, because this is another one of those common things that I've noticed. People kind of fall on either side of the line with regard to the ego. But do you think that either that it's possible or that it's something that we should pursue to dissolve the ego altogether, to get rid of it, to blow those moons right out of the sky, to have just perfectly clear skies? Or do you think that it's more practical, or the only option that we have to make the ego our friend, to sort of use it instead of being used by it, which I think a lot of people right now are ego driven. They don't actually fully control themselves. The ego controls them more. Do you think there's a way to turn the tables on the ego and to make it work for us, or is it just a matter of we got to get rid of it, we got to dissolve it, or whatever?
Well, I've read a number of things on it, and I think there's two ways to do it. It's not just one way. You can either kind of work on dissolving the ego and kind of transcending it, getting rid of all those moons and that kind of thing, or you can kind of very, very strongly develop your ego to where it's kind of perfectly in line with your self and everything else, and then it will just kind of fall away on its own. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds almost like the Carl Jung talked about it, right? Individuation, where you merge with the shadow, right? If you want to call it that. The ego, the shadow. To me, they're, if not the same thing, they're comparable. So then, because the shadow has certain attributes that I think are potentially helpful or potentially beneficial to us, but it's because it's sort of gone rogue and it's not part of the team anymore. It's doing more harm than good. So what you're describing is kind of like merging with the ego, or making it sort of like making it work for you, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think there's a difference, and most people don't make this particular difference, but I think there's a big difference between ego and mind, right? And I think ego is mostly fear-based, fear or anger or shame. Those are typically the roots of the ego, and and then that's an Enneagram teaching, and I've found that it's fairly accurate. I haven't seen too many emotions that don't branch off of those in some way. Mm-hmm. Those three main emotions: fear, anger, and shame. And it's basically the mechanism that causes you to feel separated from everything else, and that's a abnormal functioning of the mind, because it's based in concepts, not reality.
Right.
Because anytime you're feeling anger, fear, shame, it's generally because you're believing in some concept that doesn't actually exist, and that's causing you inner friction, because reality is not your concept. And so when you have some sort of concept that you're attached to that's separate from reality, you're going to feel some level of cognitive dissonance. But the mind is something different than that. The mind is not the ego, and the ego is not the mind. The mind is just the function of you thinking. It has, it doesn't have to be separated. It's just a tool that you use, but it's not yourself. It doesn't have any identity other than just a tool that you can use for a specific function. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I get where you're coming from, and I feel the same way. The mind is like an instrument, right? You can use it, you as in the self, but the ego can also use it, right? And that's when you get these anxious thoughts, fearful thoughts. That's the ego on the controls, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your mind is no longer serving you; it's serving another force, which is, again, the ego, the shadow, whatever you want to call it, and it's feeding you all these fear-based thoughts. But I wanted to circle back to something you said about the fear, anger, and shame. Those are sort of the primary emotions that you associate with the ego.
Yeah.
It's funny because in our society, when you talk about being egotistical or egoic, it's more like associated with arrogance, right?
Sure. Yep.
So do you think arrogance is more like a reaction to shame and fear? Like you're afraid that you're not good enough, so you pump yourself up by being arrogant. Is it more like a defense mechanism as a result of that?
Yeah, for sure. It's it's either I'm afraid that I'm not, so I'm gonna arrogantly pretend that I am, or that I'm ashamed that I'm not, so I'm gonna pretend that I am, or I'm angry that I'm not, so I'm gonna pretend that I am. But either way, yeah, I think it's definitely it's a visceral reaction to some type of egoic concepts that it's always that duality, right? You're usually when when your ego is doing one thing, it's secretly fearing the opposite thing.
Right. Yeah. I could see that. Yeah, it's a motherfucker, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
You always got to keep your eye on it. I sort of thought early on when I started to learn more about this and observe myself, I thought that you could get rid of the ego altogether. You could just dissolve it. But for some reason, maybe the ego's convinced me that that's not the case. But I feel like so to put it to work for you in my case, like, so instead of being sort of ego driven towards material wealth and towards being the best or whatever, being arrogant, I feel like if you can get it to work for you, you can be egoic about your spiritual practice. Like when you don't want to let yourself down, you become almost like ego driven to achieve, to be compassionate, so it gives you fuel, right? It fuels you in the right direction or the wrong direction, but if you get to choose the direction, if you can sort of get a handle on it, if you will. So
sure.
I don't know if I'm just lying to myself and giving myself comforting tales, but I feel like it has a benefit, or at least I feel like it has one to me.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of refer to it as making it carry its own cross to its own crucifixion.
Yeah.
So do I still have an ego in some way? Sure. But I can use it to get to where I'm trying to get to, which is not have it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I had a discussion with somebody a few months ago, and they were like, well, don't you think your desire to be without an ego is egotistical? And I was like, well, here's the thing. My ego is the one who's tired of being egotistical.
Yes, totally.
So it doesn't actually want to be. It really just kind of wants to rest. Like, it doesn't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And so yes, if my egoic desire was to be spiritual and holy and enlightened and all this kinds of stuff, then yeah, it probably I would agree with you. But honestly, when I look into myself, I'm just tired of fighting. Like, that's really all it comes down to. I just really want to give my poor little tired ego a break.
Yeah, take some time off, ego.
Yeah, exactly. I got this one. Just chill.
Yeah. It's like part of me thinks that maybe the ego is like sort of the sort of animal mind, right? Like the sort of the voice of the animal mind, the desires, the sort of the part of you that doesn't care that working out is good for you because it just wants to chill on the couch and drink some red wine and watch Netflix. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so if you can get that animal to work, you give it treats every once in a while. Like that's why I feel like I'm partially a hedonistic type of guy because I don't deprive myself of good foods and drinks and good times because I think like the harder you work at becoming a better person, being more balanced, being more having more equanimity and all that kind of thing, you got to reward yourself or the animal or the ego, whatever you want to call it. You got to give them you got to throw them some cookies every once in a while,
Yeah, throw them a bone.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and and I don't think that necessarily having a good time or having fun or what it necessarily has to be egotistical. It's more just when it becomes a need to have fun or a need to do this or a need to do that. That's when it really crosses the border for me, at least into ego land.
Absolutely.
And so I really think it's striking a balance between having fun and working hard, but also just knowing your limits and then knowing your being constantly aware of yourself all the time.
Yeah.
When you're having fun and when you're not having fun, especially when you're not having fun, is when you should be aware of yourself because that's where the real kind of self-knowledge happens.
100%. Yeah, I get exactly what you mean. All those times that you feel anger or anxiety or anything like that, those are clues. They're basically alarm bells going off saying, hey, there's a problem inside here. You're resisting something or you're not accepting something that is just out of your control. You need to come in here and take a look and fix this and make this go away.
Yeah, exactly. And I really feel like pain, just like, your outer pain is kind of an alarm bell for, hey, something's wrong. You need to put a Band-Aid on this or, something's going to go south. Your inner pain is the same exact thing, and it's the perfect opportunity for you to be aware of yourself whenever you're feeling any kind of internal conflict to go, hey, what is this and why?
But most people do the opposite, right? They try to run away from it to distract themselves, or they add layers and layers of useless thoughts on top of it to try to make sense of it.
Yeah, or justify it, or blame someone else. The list goes on and on. You can do lots of things with pain, but the really only helpful thing that you can do with pain is to find out why you're doing it to yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you can find the root of that question, then I feel like it's the whole point of spirituality is to kind of transcend your everyday problems into something better than yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think part of it too is transforming your suffering into something meaningful, right?
Yeah.
And by staying with it, and like you said, because sometimes I think you suffer and there's a fix. Like you can go inside and figure out what it is that what belief you're holding on to that's wrong or that's making you unhappy. But in other circumstances, like say for instance the loss of a loved one, I think you're going to feel grief and sadness, and no matter what, no matter how or at least that's the way I see it. I don't see how I could ever experience that without feeling extreme sadness. But where I draw the line is adding that extra layer to it, right? Adding I should have spent more time with them when they were alive. I should have been a better friend, or I should have, right? That's the part where I think we have a choice in some of those situations where we don't have to add to our suffering. But some suffering, I think you're going to have to experience it at some point or another.
Yeah, exactly. And we're not trying to get rid of necessarily all pain, all suffering, but mostly the self-inflicted kind is the kind we're trying to get rid of.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly right. You've got to go through some things. You don't have a choice, but you do have a choice of whether you inflict extra suffering and extra pain on yourself, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's like it's kind of like, people just binge on their suffering. Like, it's almost like eating like, some ice cream. You're like, well, I've already had, 2 scoops. Might as well eat the whole jar. Like, no, it's not. You've had 2 scoops and just stop. Like, that's good. You don't need more suffering.
Yeah, you just start to indulge, right? Well, and I think to some extent it's a spiral, right? And I mean, you said that after you lost faith, you sort of went through a spiral, and it's hard to put the brakes on something like that, especially when you don't understand why it's happening or that you can put the brakes on it.
Yeah, and that's, one of the other things is, or, like I was talking about earlier, you don't, in order to solve the puzzle, you have to know it's a puzzle, and suffering, to stop suffering, you have to find the root of the suffering. And if you don't know where it's coming from, then it's just going to spiral and get worse.
Yeah, totally. And the root of the suffering, that's, I like that you said that, because that's really key. I think in our society, especially, we tend to get focused more on the symptoms and not the root causes, whether it's an actual medicine and health or, when we're trying to figure out what are the political or systemic problems that our society is going through, people are always attacking the symptoms. And nobody's thinking to go to the roots and to find out why those symptoms are arising,
Yeah, and it's, I couldn't agree more.
Well, Tyler, I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface, but it's almost an hour since we've been talking.
Dang, went by fast.
We're going to have to do parts 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
You stopped at 8.
Octave. One thing I wanted to ask you about that we didn't really get a chance to, but for next time, I'll write it down. How do you say his name? Upensky?
I call him Ospensky, but I'm probably butchering it.
Yeah, whatever. Semantics. What's a name, right? So, anyways, he talks about remembering yourself.
Yes.
And I want to talk to you about that because that's another thing that I felt was profound. I felt that there was a nuance there that I wasn't picking up because you talked about self-observation, and I think that's different from remembering yourself. From what he was describing and how, at one point he talks about the first time he was able to do it successfully. So I really want to delve into that with you next time, Tyler.
Okay, no, that's one of my favorite topics, so we'll get into it.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe if you need to prep some notes or something so you can school me to that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks a lot for joining me, man. It was a pleasure, and I'm really glad that we were able to sit down and chat.
Awesome. Loved it. Thanks.